Good morning. Today is Tuesday, June 10th, 2025. The text of the Torah that we have in our Torah scrolls in synagogues all over the world, we've discussed many times, it's the words, the letters, there are no vowels, there's no punctuation. But there are, in a few places, some irregularities that appear in the Torah scroll, and we've discussed them. A few places there's a letter larger than normal, a few places there's a letter smaller than normal, a few places there are letters or words that have dots on top of them. We've discussed that. But the most unique is in this week's Torah portion, the Parsha Baloscha, where we find two backward nuns, the Hebrew letter nun, and they're there as symbols, and it is the only place in the Torah where this symbol occurs. Now, what's fascinating is, of course, we accept as a fundamental belief that the Torah that we have in our Torah scroll is exactly word for word what God said to Moshe at Mount Sinai, and Moshe taught to the Jewish people and wrote in the Torah scroll. However, these markings appear differently in different Torah texts. There is no, even though the words and the letters of the Torah don't change, but this symbol, these two symbols, they appear differently in different Torah scrolls, and they have appeared differently over the last 1,000 years. Now, the most common, and what we have in most of our Torah scrolls, is a nun, the letter nun, which is backwards before this passage, and then the same backward nun after the passage. However, there are Torah scrolls and there are written accounts of this symbol not being the letter nun, but having the shape of a shofar, or in some cases the shape of a fish hook, sometimes with a dot on top. So let me try to show you. It may not be so easy to see. I'm going to try to show you this. So, one second, let me do this. So this, I don't know if you can see it, this where I have my finger, that's the regular nun, the way that it's written in the Torah. This is a nun that's upside down. This is what we have in most of our Torah scrolls, a nun that is backwards. But you also see this letter, which is a nun, but it's kind of in the shape of a Z, a Z. Kind of in the shape of a Z, unusual. And that's besides the shofar looking and the fish hook appearance. And just to show it to you, the way it looks in a Torah scroll, again, this is just a small passage, and I'm going to go through the passage in a moment, but you'll notice there's a nun, backward nun here, and a backward nun here, if you can see it. It may be hard to see. And that's how it appears in the Torah scroll. The simplest explanation of the shape is that the letter nun is the closest Hebrew letter to what we would call a parenthesis. So let's look at the context where this occurs and try to understand what's going on. In this week's Torah portion, we have the Parsha Baloscha, we have the narrative of Chovav, who is the father-in-law of Moshe. We also know him as Yisro. Remember, he had more than one name. Earlier in the Torah, he's called Yisro. Here, he's called Chovav. And Moshe says to his father-in-law, we're ready to go into Israel. Come with us. This is before the sin of the spies. This is before the sin that caused that they would have to wander for 40 years. They had received the Torah, they built the Mishkan, and they're ready to go into Israel. And Moshe says to Chovav, come with us. And Chovav says, V'yomer elav, Chovav says to him, Lo elech, I'm not coming. V'yomer, Moshe says to Chovav, Al not tazov otanu. Don't abandon us, don't leave us. Which, by the way, if you heard me speak, and I spoke about what the taxi driver said to me when he picked me up to bring me to the airport, Lama tazov otani, why are you abandoning us? It's a paraphrase of this verse. And I still remember, why did I leave Israel? Why? And when will I go back? Okay. But apparently, there's no answer after that. So apparently, Moshe wanted his father-in-law to stay, but apparently he did not. Okay, that's narrative number one. The next narrative is a very, very negative narrative. I mean, Chovav refusing to come is somewhat negative. I mean, why wouldn't he come? He had seen the miracles. Moshe was his son-in-law. Okay, that's one. Next one is Vayihi ha'am k'mis onanin rabaz Hashem. The Jewish people start to complain. So this is now the beginning of what we're going to see a number of times in the Torah. They started to complain. They complained about the food. They complained about the traveling. They complained not having meat. They complained they wanted to go back to Egypt. They were complaining, and Hashem was very, very angry with them. Now, in between that, there are two verses, two psukim. And these two psukim are very familiar to us because we say them in the davening in synagogue every time we read from the Torah. Vayihi bin Saharon, and it was when the ark of God traveled. Vayomer Moshe, Moshe said, Kuma Hashem, arise God, v'yafutzu oivecha, and scatter your enemies. V'yanusu misanecha mipanecha, and your enemies will run away from in front of you. That's what Moshe would say when it was time to travel, when the Aron, the ark, would start to travel, and that meant, of course, the entire Jewish people would follow. That's verse number one. Next pasuk, Uvnucha Yomar, and when the ark rested, Moshe would say, Shuva Hashem, return God to the Rivavos Alfei Yisrael, to the hundreds of thousands of Jews that were encamped. So, of course, in our davening, we say the first pasuk when we take out the Torah from the ark, and we say the second pasuk when we put the Torah back into the ark. But obviously, these two verses don't apparently have anything to do with either the narrative before or the narrative after. And these two verses are surrounded by this symbol, a backwards nun. There's a backwards nun before the word Vayihi ben Saharon, and there's a backwards nun after the words Rivavos Alfei Yisrael. So that's the context. Now, these strange symbols were known even at the time of the Talmud. The Talmud says that God himself made signs, simanim, for this portion, for these two verses, above and below, meaning before and after. What do they mean? Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that they mean that this text does not belong here. It really belongs in another part of the Torah. So it's as if these two verses are in parentheses because they don't really belong here, they belong somewhere else. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says, these marks, the inverted nuns, these marks denote that these two verses are one full book of the Torah. It is not true that there are 5 books of the Torah. According to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and also according to, also according to Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman, in another place in the Torah, that these 2 verses comprise an independent book of the Torah. So there are 5 books of the Torah. There's Bereshis, Shemos, Vayikra, the beginning of Bamidbar, these 2 verses, the end of Bamidbar, and Dvarim. 7 books of the Torah. Who knew? Now, in the passage in the Talmud, these marks are called simanim, symbols, marks, symbols, but there is no indication of what their shape is, just that there are these marks. Of course, according to the opinion that these verses belong somewhere else, begs the question of, number one, why are they put here if they don't belong here? And number 2, where do they belong? Okay, that's a question we'll leave for another time. According to the opinion that it's a separate book, the question is, well, first of all, don't we all know that there are 5 books of the Torah? How is it possible that there are actually 7? And second of all, how do these 2 verses by themselves comprise an entire book that has some kind of equal weight as Bereshis and Shemos and Dvarim? It's 2 verses. And what is the theme? What's the purpose of this being an entire separate book by itself of just 2 verses? Okay, we've discussed both of those questions at other times, and we'll come back to them another time. Rashi on Chumash says that the reason there are these 2 signs, the 2 backward nuns, is to separate the 2 negative narratives. There's a narrative that's negative about Chovav, that he refuses to come with the Jewish people. That's negative. And then there's a narrative about the people complaining, and that Hashem is very angry, and that's very negative. So we don't want to have 2 negative things next to each other. We want to break it up. And we break it up with something that is not negative. So to show that these 2 verses are meant to interrupt the negativity of the 2 surrounding narratives, there are these symbols. That's what Rashi says. I've shared with you before the approach, the magnificent approach of the Rav, Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik. I'm not going to repeat that now. There is a problem with the theory of these 2 marks being parentheses. Because yes, it's true, the letter Nun, as it's written in the Torah, is very similar to a parentheses or to a bracket. However, they're both backwards. So the one after the passage makes sense. It would be like a bracket after. But the one before, it's not facing towards the text, it's facing away from the text. So it doesn't seem like that would be a bracket. A bracket or parentheses is around the text that you mean to highlight. Okay. I want to share with you a different approach. It's a completely different meaning, and it is a completely different understanding of what we are meant to get from it every year when we read this Torah portion. And I want to share with you the approach of the Zohar. The Zohar, of course, is the main fundamental text of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. And the Zohar says that the letter Nun is meant to indicate the Shekhinah, the feminine aspect of God's presence. And so the Zohar asks, how should we examine, how should we understand the backward Nun in 2 places here in this Torah portion? So listen to what the Zohar says. It's incredible. The Zohar describes the nuns, which represent God's presence, surrounding the text. And remember, they're surrounding the text of when the ark would move and when the ark would rest. So remember that the Shekhinah, God's presence, dwelled above the Mishkan, above the ark. Remember the Nani Akava, the cloud of glory, would rest above the Mishkan, above the Aron, above the ark. And the Aron, the Torah tells us, would travel ahead of the Jewish people. So the Aron, the ark, would travel first, and then the Jewish people in their encampment, the way the Torah described in last week's Torah portion, would then follow. And the purpose of that, with the Shekhinah above the Aron, the purpose, according to the Zohar, is that the Aron was sent ahead to scout out the route, and for Hashem's presence, the Shekhinah, to protect the people of Israel as they were coming this way, to make sure that the route was safe for them and comfortable for them. And so this aspect of the Nun is depicting the love that God has for the Jewish people, looking out for the Jewish people and protecting them in every moment. The Zohar then asks, come and see the love that the Holy One, blessed is He, has towards Israel. For even though they stray from the straight path, the Holy One, blessed is He, does not wish to abandon them. And God constantly turns His face towards them. Otherwise, we would not endure in this world. What a beautiful sentiment. You see this because the ark, the Aron, the holy ark, traveled before the Jewish people, and the Nun stayed with the ark. But, so that means the Nun is in front of the ark. I'm sorry, the Nun and the ark is in front of the Jewish people. So the Nun represents God's presence above the ark, but when the ark travels before the Jewish people, God's presence turns around in order to face the Jewish people, as if to say, even though I'm walking in front of you, you are still my beloved, and I'm thinking of you, and I'm protecting you. So the Nun before the words Vayihi b'nso Haron, which is talking about the ark, the Nun does not face the ark. The Nun faces away from the ark because the Nun is facing the Jewish people who are walking behind the ark. So Moshe would say, Kuma Hashem, rise up God, and the enemies will scatter before you. And what Moshe is saying is, don't abandon us, Hashem. You're going in front of us, but don't abandon us. Turn your face back towards us so that we know that you're loving us. And so the Nun turned back. So the Nun is facing away from the words, Vayihi b'nso Haron. That's why the first Nun is backward, facing away from the Aron, from the ark, Vayihi b'nso Haron. And when the ark rested, then Moshe would say, Shuva Hashem, return God to the people, and the Shekhinah, God's presence, would stand on the other side and then face both the ark and the Jewish people. So that God's Shekhinah was facing both the Aron, the ark, and the Jewish people, and that's why that second Nun is backward, because it's facing now that the ark has rested. If you have a chance this Shabbos, if you're in the synagogue, maybe at Hagbah, when the Torah is lifted and turned around for everyone to see, if you're able to kind of come a little bit close, try to see these two nuns, the only place in the Torah And if you can't do that even in a chumash, usually in a printed chumash, the backward nuns will be there. And try to look for it. And focus on what it means. The intense love that God has for the Jewish people. And the way that God protects the Jewish people at all times. Sometimes we do not see that protection. Sometimes it appears to us to be absent. But that protection is there. And this week especially, perhaps we should look at these nuns in the form of a prayer that we should be able to see and feel God's protection when we have not been able to recently. The love and protection that God has for the Jewish people is the ultimate meaning of this unique symbol. My friends, I wish you a great day, and I look forward to seeing you soon in person.